The old bookshop on Cherry Lane was the kind of place most people walked past without noticing. Tucked between a busy coffee shop and a cell phone repair store, its faded sign and dusty windows didn't exactly invite casual browsers. But for David Parker, it had become a Sunday afternoon ritual to spend hours wandering through the narrow aisles, running his fingers along the spines of forgotten books. David wasn't what you'd call remarkable at first glance. A man in his early 30s with glasses that constantly slid down his nose, he taught history at the local high school. His students thought he was decent enough, not too strict, but not exactly the cool teacher either. He lived alone in a small apartment with too many books and a cat named Einstein, who cared more about napping and sunbeams than Einstein's actual theories. This particular Sunday seemed like any other as David pushed open the creaky door of Hartman's used books. The familiar smell of old paper and dust greeted him like an old friend. "Afternoon, Mr. Parker," called Mr. Hartman from behind the counter. The shop owner was a thin, elderly man who seemed as much a part of the store as the shelves themselves. "Got some new arrivals in the history section you might like." David nodded appreciatively. "Thanks. I'll check them out." He wandered toward the back of the store, where the history books were shelved in a chaotic system only Mr. Hartman truly understood. World War II memoirs sat beside ancient Egyptian art books, while Civil War diaries might be found next to histories of Chinese dynasties. David never minded the disorder. Half the fun was discovering unexpected treasures. As he turned down the narrowest aisle, he noticed he wasn't alone. A boy of about 14 was sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in a thick book. What caught David's attention wasn't just the unusual sight of a teenager in a used bookstore on a Sunday, but the boy's intense concentration. He was reading as if the world around him had completely disappeared. David tried to step past without disturbing him, but the floorboard creaked loudly. The boy looked up, startled. "Sorry," David said. "Don't mind me." The boy quickly closed the book and started to get up. "No, I'm in the way, sorry." "You're fine," David assured him. "What are you reading that's so interesting?" The boy hesitated, then held up the book. It was an old cloth-bound volume titled Letters from the Front, Personal Accounts of the Pacific War, 1942-1945. "My grandfather fought in the Pacific," the boy explained, his voice quiet but clear. "He never talks about it, though." David's interest was immediately piqued, both professionally as a history teacher and personally as someone who had always been fascinated by World War II. "That's a rare find," he commented. "First-hand accounts are invaluable for understanding what it was really like." The boy nodded, looking back at the book with something like reverence. "I found some old medals in my grandpa's desk drawer when I was looking for tape. When I asked about them, he just said they weren't important, and closed the drawer." There was something in the boy's expression that struck David, a mixture of curiosity and concern, that seemed mature beyond his years. "I'm David, by the way," he offered. "I teach history at Pine Ridge High." "I'm Tyler," the boy replied. "I go to Westfield Middle." David carefully lowered himself to sit on a small stool nearby, not wanting to tower over the boy. "So you're trying to learn about what your grandfather might have experienced?" Tyler nodded. "I think something bad happened. Sometimes he wakes up yelling in the night. Mom says he's had nightmares for as long as she can. Remember, the simple observation revealed a depth of perception that surprised David. Here was a teenager trying to understand the invisible wounds of war that had shaped his grandfather, wounds that had clearly been left unaddressed for decades. "The Pacific campaign was particularly brutal," David said gently. "Many veterans came home with experiences they couldn't talk about." "That's what I'm learning," Tyler said, tapping the book. "Some of these letters, they're hard to read, not because of the words, but because of what they saw." David was impressed. Most of his students could barely muster interest in history beyond what might appear on a test. Yet here was this kid, voluntarily digging into primary sources to understand his family's past. "How long has your grandfather lived with you?" David asked. "Since my grandma died last year," Tyler explained. "He moved into our spare room. Dad built a ramp for his wheelchair, and you're close to him." Tyler seemed to consider this. "I want to be," he finally said. "But it's like there's this wall. He's nice and everything, teaches me card games and helps with my math homework. But whenever I ask about his life when he was young, he changes the subject. David nodded, understanding. Some generations were taught that certain things weren't discussed, especially difficult experiences. But isn't talking supposed to help? Tyler asked, genuine confusion in his voice. That's what our school counselor always says. Ideally, yes, David agreed. But for people who lived through major trauma, especially in an era when nobody talked about mental health, staying silent became a way of coping. Tyler frowned thoughtfully. So by trying to get him to talk, am I making things worse? The question revealed such thoughtfulness that David felt a renewed faith in the younger generation. Not necessarily, he said carefully, but it might help to approach it differently. Instead of asking directly about the war, maybe ask about the friends he made or places he saw before or after the difficult parts. Tyler's face brightened slightly. That makes sense. Sort of. Go around the hard stuff instead of through it? Exactly, David nodded. Sometimes people find it easier to approach painful memories indirectly. A comfortable silence fell between them as Tyler reopened the book, gently turning its yellowed pages. David found himself curiously drawn to this earnest young person with an old soul. In 15 years of teaching, he'd encountered plenty of bright students, but rarely one who showed such empathy and depth of interest outside the classroom. Are you planning to buy the book? David asked after a while. Tyler's expression fell slightly. I wish I could, but it's $75. He carefully returned it to its place on the shelf. I've been coming in to read it bit by bit. Mr. Hartman doesn't mind as long as I'm careful with it. David glanced toward the front of the store, where the elderly shop owner was helping another customer. He's a good man, David agreed. Been running this place for over 40 years from what I understand. He knew my grandma, Tyler added. Sometimes he tells me stories about when they were in high school together. Small world, David remarked with a smile. He stood up, his knees protesting slightly. Well, I'll let you get back to your reading. It was nice meeting you, Tyler. You too, the boy replied, already reopening the book. David continued browsing, but his thoughts kept returning to the boy and his quest to understand his grandfather. There was something deeply moving about this teenager trying to bridge a generational gap, to understand the shadows that haunted an old man's dreams. When David finally selected a couple of books and approached the counter to pay, he found himself glancing back toward the history section where Tyler remained absorbed in his reading. I see you met our Sunday regular, Mr. Hartman commented as he rang up David's purchases. Bright kid, that one. He seems to be, David agreed. Said he's been reading that Pacific War book piece by piece. Mr. Hartman nodded, a knowing look in his faded blue eyes. His grandfather is Joe Miller. We served together, though Joe was in the Pacific and I was in Europe. Different hells, same war. David's interest deepened. Tyler mentioned his grandfather doesn't talk about his experiences. Joe saw things no human should see, Mr. Hartman said quietly. Spent 3 days floating on a piece of debris after his ship was hit. Lost most of his unit, the old man shook his head slowly. Some wounds never fully heal. As David paid for his books, an idea began to form in his mind. That book Tyler's reading, would you hold it for me? I'll come back for it next Sunday. Mr. Hartman raised an eyebrow but nodded. Sure thing. Any particular reason? David glanced back at Tyler, who remained unaware of their conversation. Just think it might help him understand some things. As David left the bookshop that day, he felt an unexpected connection to the boy he'd just met and the grandfather he'd never known. There was something powerful about the way history lived on in the present, not just in books and documents, but in the nightmares of old men and the questions of their grandchildren. He couldn't explain the impulse that had led him to reserve the book. He wasn't wealthy by any means. A teacher's salary only stretched so far. But something about Tyler's quest to understand his grandfather's silence had touched him deeply. Sometimes, David thought as he walked home through the autumn afternoon, the most important histories weren't found in textbooks or classrooms. They were written in the lines on people's faces, in the stories they couldn't tell, and in the determination of those who loved them enough to try to understand. The following Sunday couldn't come soon enough. The week passed slowly for David. Between grading papers and preparing lessons, his thoughts often drifted to Tyler and his silent grandfather. There was something about their story that resonated with him in ways he couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was because David's own grandfather had also served in World War II, though he died when David was only 7. The few memories he had were of a quiet man who smiled rarely and jumped at loud noises. David's father had once explained that Grandpa had seen things in the war, a vague explanation that satisfied a child, but left the adult David with countless questions. By Friday afternoon, David found himself incorporating more personal accounts into his World War II unit. Instead of focusing solely on battles and political strategies, he brought in letters from soldiers, nurses, and civilians. His students seemed unusually engaged, leaning forward when he read aloud a particularly moving passage from a Marine who'd fought at Iwo Jima. "Why didn't they talk more about what happened when they got home?" asked one girl, a thoughtful student who usually stayed quiet during discussions. "It seems like everyone just expected them to go back to normal life." "That's an excellent question," David replied, pleased by her insight. In that era, there wasn't much understanding of what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The prevailing attitude was to move forward and not dwell on painful experiences. "That's messed up," another student commented. "So they just suffered in silence?" "Many did," David confirmed. "Some found ways to cope: work, family, hobbies, while others struggled with alcoholism, nightmares, or difficulty maintaining relationships. It wasn't until decades later that society really began acknowledging the psychological impact of war. As his students filed out at the bell, David found himself thinking again of Tyler's grandfather, a man who still battled nightmares 75 years after whatever horrors he'd witnessed. What might his life have been like if he'd been able to talk about his experiences? If he'd received help instead of silence? Sunday finally arrived, crisp and bright. David walked to the bookstore with purpose, arriving just as Mr. Hartman was unlocking the door. "Right on time," the older man greeted him. "I've got that book set aside for you." David followed him to the counter where the cloth-bound volume waited. Up close, it was even more impressive. A first edition with its original dust jacket preserved in a protective cover. "It's in remarkable condition," David commented as he paid for it. "Books tend to last when they're treated with respect," Mr. Hartman replied with a small smile, "unlike people who wear out no matter how carefully you handle them." There was something in the old man's tone that made David look at him more closely. "You said you served with Tyler's grandfather?" Mr. Hartman nodded, his gaze turning distant. "Different theaters, but same war. We knew each other from school before we enlisted. Joe was the star quarterback, had a scholarship lined up, never got to use it though. The war changed his path like it did for so many." David carefully placed the book in his messenger bag. "Tyler mentioned his grandfather doesn't talk about his experiences." "Some memories are best left buried," Mr. Hartman said quietly. Then, noticing David's expression, he added, "Or at least that's what men of our generation were taught to believe. The world's different now. Maybe that's for the better." David was about to respond when the shop door opened and Tyler walked in, bringing a gust of autumn air with him. The boy's face lit up with recognition. "Hi, Mr. Parker," he called, approaching them. "You're here early." "Just picking up a special order," David replied, patting his bag. "And please call me David, I'm not your teacher." Tyler nodded, then turned to Mr. Hartman. "Is it okay if I continue reading that book today?" The old bookseller exchanged a glance with David before responding. "Actually, Tyler, that book has been sold." The disappointment on the boy's face was immediate and profound. "Oh," he said quietly. "I guess that makes sense. It was really valuable." David felt a moment of doubt about his plan. What if the boy resented his interference? But it was too late to turn back now. "Tyler, would you mind walking with me for a bit? I'd like to talk to you about something." Curiosity replaced disappointment as Tyler nodded. "Sure, I guess." They said goodbye to Mr. Hartman and stepped outside into the sunshine. David suggested they walk to the small park across the street, where they found an empty bench overlooking a duck pond. "So," David began, suddenly nervous, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about your grandfather and his experiences in the war." Tyler looked up, interest clear in his eyes. "Yeah? I think what you're doing, trying to understand what he went through, is really important. Not many people your age would take the time." Tyler shrugged, but David could tell the compliment pleased him. "I just want to know why he has nightmares, and maybe help somehow." "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you." David reached into his bag and pulled out the book. "I bought this for you." Tyler's eyes widened as David handed him the cloth-bound volume. "What? But it's so expensive." "Consider it an investment in understanding," David said. Some things are worth more than money. The boy ran his fingers reverently over the cover. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. You don't need to say anything, David assured him. But I do have a suggestion for how you might use it. Tyler looked up, waiting. Instead of trying to get your grandfather to talk about his own experiences directly, maybe share some of these letters with him. Read one aloud and see how he responds. It might open a door. Tyler considered this. Like it might be easier for him to talk about other people's experiences first? Exactly, David nodded, impressed by the boy's quick understanding. Sometimes it's easier to approach difficult memories sideways. Tyler carefully opened the book, turning to a page he'd clearly read before. There's this letter from a sailor named Frank who was at Pearl Harbor. It's really powerful. Maybe I could start with that one. That sounds perfect, David agreed. Just be patient and go slow. And be prepared that he might not respond the way you hope at first. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a family of ducks glide across the pond. Finally, Tyler spoke again, his voice thoughtful. Why are you doing this? Helping me, I mean. You don't even know me. It was a fair question, one that David had been asking himself all week. Partly because I'm a history teacher, and personal histories are the most important kind, he began. But mostly because my own grandfather was a veteran too. He died when I was young, before I could ask him about his experiences. I guess I see this as a second chance in a way. Tyler nodded slowly, seeming to understand. So you never got to know what happened to him in the war? Only bits and pieces from my father, David confirmed. Like your grandfather, mine didn't talk about it much. It left a kind of gap in my understanding of who he was. That makes sense, Tyler said. He carefully placed the book in his backpack. I should probably get home. Grandpa will be wondering where I am. We usually watch old westerns together on Sunday afternoons. As they stood to leave, Tyler surprised David by offering his hand for a handshake, a curiously adult gesture from a teenager. Thank you, really. This means a lot. David shook his hand, feeling an unexpected connection to this thoughtful young person. I'd be interested to hear how it goes if you feel like sharing. Maybe I'll stop by the bookstore next Sunday, Tyler suggested. If you'll be there? I'm there most Sundays, David confirmed. It's kind of my tradition. As they parted ways, David felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction at having done something meaningful, but also a poignant sense of connection to his own past, to the grandfather he'd never truly known. The following week moved quickly, with parent-teacher conferences keeping David at school late into the evenings. By Sunday, he was looking forward to the peaceful quiet of Hartman's used books as a respite from the busy week. When he arrived shortly after noon, the bell above the door announcing his entrance, he immediately noticed Tyler sitting in the same spot as before. The boy looked up at the sound, his face breaking into a smile when he recognized David. You came, Tyler exclaimed, getting to his feet. I was hoping you would. I said I'd be here, David reminded him with a smile. How did things go with your grandfather? Tyler's expression grew more serious. It was intense but good, I think. Can we talk about it? They found a quiet corner at the back of the store, where two worn armchairs faced each other beside a window overlooking the street. As they settled in, David noticed that Tyler seemed both excited and somehow more mature than he had the week before. So I read him the Pearl Harbor letter first, Tyler began. He just listened quietly. I couldn't tell if it was affecting him or not. But then I read a second one, from a Marine who was at a place called Tarawa. David nodded, recognizing the name of one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific campaign. Grandpa got really still. Tyler continued. When I finished reading, he said, I was there. Just those 3 words, but his voice sounded different, kind of hollow. It was the first time he'd ever mentioned anything specific about the war to me. That's significant, David said softly. He opened a door that's probably been closed for decades. Tyler nodded eagerly. After that, he asked to hold the book. He just looked at it for a long time, turning pages, not really reading. Then he asked if I could come back later with a cup of tea. When I came back, he had this old wooden box on his lap that I'd never seen before. David leaned forward, drawn into the story. What was in it? Letters, Tyler said simply. Dozens of them tied with string. And photos. And his dog tags. He said he hasn't opened that box since 1947. The significance of this revelation wasn't lost on David. For a veteran, to revisit such carefully preserved yet deliberately hidden memories represented a monumental shift. He didn't say much more that day, Tyler continued, but the next evening he called me into his room and showed me a picture of his unit. 22 men in uniform standing in front of a palm tree. He pointed to each one and told me their names and where they were from. Like he'd been carrying these details for 75 years, waiting for someone to hear them. David felt a lump forming in his throat. That's incredibly moving, Tyler. What you've done, creating that safe space for him to begin sharing, that's a profound gift. Tyler looked down, suddenly seeming younger again. I didn't do much. It was the book that helped. The book was just a tool, David corrected gently. Your approach, your patience and compassion, that's what made the difference. They talked for almost an hour, Tyler sharing more details about the gradual way his grandfather had begun opening up. Some days he'd share small anecdotes about friends he'd made during training. Other days he'd sit silently, looking through the letters in the wooden box. There had been tears a few times, quickly wiped away with weathered hands. Mom says she's never seen anything like it, Tyler added. She tried for years to get him to talk about the war, but he always shut down completely. She can't believe he's sharing these things with me. Sometimes it's easier to open up to someone from a different generation, David suggested. There's less baggage, less history of avoidance. As their conversation wound down, Tyler reached into his backpack and pulled out an envelope. I almost forgot. Grandpa wanted me to give you this. Surprised, David accepted the envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph of two young men in uniform, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grins on their faces despite the serious circumstances. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was a note. Joe Miller and Bill Hartman, Boot Camp, 1943. Thank you for helping my grandson understand what I couldn't explain. Some burdens are lighter when shared. David stared at the photograph in his hands, a strange tightness in his chest. The two young men looking back at him, barely more than boys really, bore little resemblance to the elderly men he knew. Joe Miller, now confined to a wheelchair with nightmares that wouldn't fade, and Bill Hartman, the quiet bookshop owner who'd never once mentioned his service during all the years David had been coming to his store. I had no idea they knew each other before the war, David said finally, looking up at Tyler. Me neither, the boy replied. Mr. Hartman never said anything when I talked about Grandpa. But when I told Grandpa where I'd been reading the book, he got this funny look and asked if old Bill still ran the place. David carefully returned the photo to its envelope. This is a tremendous gift, Tyler. Please thank your grandfather for me. You could thank him yourself, Tyler suggested, a hint of nervousness in his voice. He actually asked if you might want to come over sometime, to talk about history stuff. The invitation caught David by surprise. Really, he wants to meet me? Tyler nodded. He said anyone who understands the importance of letters from the past is someone worth knowing. The boy grinned. I think that's his way of saying thank you. Something warm unfurled in David's chest, a feeling of connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. I'd be honored to meet him. When would be a good time? They settled on the following Saturday afternoon. As Tyler got up to leave, he paused, seeming to debate something internally. There's something else, he said finally. Grandpa asked if Mr. Hartman might want to come too. They haven't seen each other since Grandma's funeral last year. David glanced toward the front of the store, where the elderly owner was carefully dusting a shelf of first editions. I can ask him, but it might be better coming from your grandfather directly. Old friendships have their own complexities. Tyler nodded, understanding. I'll tell Grandpa. Maybe he'll call Mr. Hartman himself. After Tyler left, David made his way to the front of the store, the envelope with the photograph still in his hand. Mr. Hartman looked up as he approached. Find anything interesting today? The older man asked, his routine question taking on new meaning in light of what David now knew. Actually, yes, David replied, holding up the envelope. Tyler brought this for me, a photograph of you and his grandfather from 1943. Mr. Hartman's hand paused in its dusting motion. Did he now? He said softly. Didn't know Joe had kept any of those old pictures. He apparently has a box full of letters and photographs that he's recently started sharing with Tyler. The bookshop owner's weathered face revealed little, but David noticed a slight tremble in his hand as he set down the feather duster. Joe was always the sentimental one for all his tough talk, he said finally. Kept every letter his mother sent him during the war. Read them so many times they were falling apart by the time we shipped out. David sensed there was more to the story of these two men than a simple childhood friendship. Tyler mentioned his grandfather would like to see you, that you haven't connected since his grandmother's funeral. Mr. Hartman moved behind the counter, putting physical distance between himself and the conversation. War creates bonds between men, he said vaguely. But life has a way of pulling people in different directions afterward. There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, so David simply nodded. Well, I've been invited to visit with Joe this Saturday. Tyler mentioned his grandfather was going to call you about joining us. A complex emotion flickered across Mr. Hartman's face, something like longing mixed with apprehension. We'll see, was all he said before turning to help another customer who had approached the register. David left the bookshop that day with more questions than answers, feeling as though he'd stumbled into a story much larger and more complicated than he'd initially realized. The week passed quickly, and before David knew it, Saturday had arrived. He found himself standing on the porch of a modest one-story house in a quiet neighborhood, a bottle of good scotch in hand. A gift for Joe Miller. He'd debated what to bring, finally settling on something his own father had once mentioned was appreciated by men of that generation. Tyler answered the door with an enthusiastic greeting, ushering David into a home that smelled of fresh coffee and something baking. The living room was comfortably worn, furniture that had clearly served the family for decades, walls lined with photographs chronicling generations of milestones. In the center of the room, beside a picture window overlooking a small garden, sat an elderly man in a wheelchair. Despite the physical limitations of age and whatever injuries had necessitated the wheelchair, Joseph Miller had an unmistakable dignity about him. His back was straight, his white hair neatly combed, his gaze direct and assessing as David entered. "Grandpa, this is Mr. Parker. David," Tyler introduced. "The one I told you about." Joe Miller extended a hand that bore the liver spots and blue veins of age but still possessed a firm grip. "Joe Miller, thank you for coming and for what you did for my grandson." "The pleasure is mine, sir," David replied, meaning it. "Tyler's quest to understand your experiences is something I found deeply moving." Joe gestured to an armchair nearby. "Have a seat. Tyler tells me you teach history. World history and U.S. history at Pine Ridge High," David confirmed, settling into the chair. He offered the bottle of scotch. "I brought this for you. I hope it's acceptable." A small smile crossed Joe's face as he accepted the gift. More than acceptable. A man of good taste, I see. He set the bottle on a small table beside his wheelchair. "We'll open that a bit later, perhaps." A woman in her 40s, Tyler's mother, David presumed, brought in coffee and freshly baked cookies, introducing herself as Karen. "Dad's been looking forward to this visit all week," she told David warmly. "It's been quite a change around here since Tyler started reading those letters to him." "A good change, I hope?" David asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "The best kind," she confirmed, her eyes shining with emotion. "He's more engaged, more present. It's like he's finally allowing himself to remember not just the horror, but the whole experience, including the good parts." As Karen left to answer a phone call, Joe fixed his gaze on David. "So, young man, Tyler says you have an interest in personal histories. I believe they're the foundation of all other history," David replied. "The textbooks give us dates and facts, but the letters, diaries, and memories give us the human truth of events." Joe nodded approvingly. "Well put. Most people see World War II as a collection of battles and political decisions. They forget it was experienced one day at a time by millions of ordinary people who never expected to find themselves in extraordinary circumstances." This opened a conversation that flowed with surprising ease. Joe shared stories of his early days in the Navy, the friends he'd made during training, the mix of excitement and fear as they shipped out to the Pacific. Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor between them, occasionally adding a comment or question but mostly listening with rapt attention. "The thing people don't understand about war," Joe said at one point, "is that it's mostly tedium punctuated by moments of absolute terror. You spend weeks doing routine tasks, battling boredom and heat and insects, then suddenly you're fighting for your life and watching friends die around you." He paused, seeming surprised by his own candor. I haven't spoken about these things in decades. Strange how the words come now when I'm an old man. Some experiences take a lifetime to process, David suggested gently. Joe's weathered face softened. Perhaps you're right. Or perhaps it just took finding the right listener. He glanced fondly at his grandson. Tyler doesn't judge or pity. He just wants to understand. The conversation shifted to Joe's life after the war, his marriage to Tyler's grandmother, his career as a civil engineer, the children he'd raised, including Karen. There were visible gaps in the narrative, periods where Joe clearly struggled with readjustment, and likely the symptoms of what modern medicine would call PTSD, though he didn't dwell on these darker times. They had been talking for nearly 2 hours when the doorbell rang. Tyler jumped up to answer it, and a moment later, Bill Hartman stepped into the living room, leaning on a cane and carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. A profound silence fell as the two elderly men looked at each other. David and Tyler exchanged glances, suddenly feeling like intruders in a deeply private moment. "You came," Joe said finally, his voice rougher than it had been. "You called," Bill replied simply. "First time in what, 20 years? "Too long," Joe acknowledged. "Far too long." The tension in the room was palpable but not exactly negative, more like the static electricity before a storm, charged with unspoken history. "We should give you two some privacy," David suggested, beginning to rise. "No," Joe said firmly. "Stay, both of you. There's been enough privacy over the years. Too many things left unsaid in the dark." Bill moved further into the room, taking the seat Karen had vacated earlier. He placed the wrapped package on the coffee table between them. "Brought you something. Found it when I was clearing out some old boxes in the store's back room." Joe unwrapped the package with careful hands to reveal a small, leather-bound book. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Bill with eyes suddenly bright with moisture. "You kept it all these years?" "Couldn't bring myself to throw it away," Bill replied with a small shrug that failed to disguise the emotion behind the gesture. "Thought you might want it back." Tyler leaned forward curiously. "What is it, Grandpa?" Joe opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten poetry. "Something I wrote during the war," he explained, his voice unsteady. "Gave it to Bill for safekeeping before we shipped out to different theaters. Said if anything happened to me, he should burn it. Nobody else was to read it. But nothing happened to you," Bill said quietly. "You came back." "We both did." "Not the same men who left," Joe pointed out. "No," Bill agreed. "Not the same at all. There was something in this exchange that hinted at depths David could only guess at, some shared understanding that went beyond their common experience of war." Tyler broke the tension with his characteristic directness. "So did you guys lose touch after the war?" The two old men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Not exactly," Joe finally answered. "We stayed in touch for a while. Then there was a disagreement about how to live after what we'd seen." Bill nodded slowly. "Joe wanted to put it all behind him. Never speak of it again. I thought that was a mistake." "And I thought you couldn't move forward if you kept looking back," Joe countered. "We were both right and both wrong, I suppose." David watched this exchange with fascination, sensing they were witnessing the continuation of a conversation that had begun decades earlier. "The past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole," Bill said, gesturing toward Joe's poetry book. "It finds ways to resurface, like nightmares that wake your family in the dark," Joe acknowledged with a rueful smile. "Point taken, old friend." The use of those two simple words, old friend, seemed to release something in the room. The tension eased, replaced by a more comfortable atmosphere as Karen returned with fresh coffee and insisted Bill stay for dinner. As the afternoon progressed into evening, David found himself deeply moved by the unfolding reconciliation between these two men. Whatever had driven them apart seemed insignificant now in the face of their shared history and advancing years. During dinner, the conversation flowed more easily, with Bill and Joe occasionally finishing each other's sentences or contradicting a detail in the other's stories, much to Tyler's obvious delight. David mostly listened, occasionally asking questions that helped draw out more memories from both men. "You know what I still remember most clearly?" Joe said at one point. "Not the fighting or the fear, but those moments of unexpected beauty. Sunsets over the Pacific that looked like the world was on fire in the most glorious way. Stars so bright and close you felt you could reach up and touch them." Bill nodded. In Europe, it was the resilience of life, flowers growing in the rubble of bombed-out buildings, children playing in streets that had seen unspeakable violence just days before. That's what kept us human, I think, Joe added thoughtfully, finding beauty amidst all that destruction. David glanced at Tyler and saw the boy watching his grandfather with a new understanding, not just as an elderly man with painful memories, but as someone who had witnessed both the worst and the best of humanity, who had carried those complex truths silently for decades. As the evening drew to a close, David helped Karen clear the dinner dishes while Tyler showed Bill some of his school projects in the living room. Finding himself alone with Joe for a moment, David felt compelled to express his gratitude. "Thank you for sharing your experiences," he said simply. "It's an honor to hear history from those who lived it." Joe looked up at him with clear eyes that had seen more than David could imagine. "Thank you for helping my grandson find a way to ask his questions, and for bringing Bill back into my life even if that wasn't your intention." "I didn't do much," David demurred. "Sometimes the smallest actions create the largest ripples," Joe replied. "One book, one conversation, they can change the course of a life, or in this case, the final chapters of one." There was a wisdom in those words that stayed with David long after he'd said his goodbyes and headed home that evening. As he drove through the quiet streets, he reflected on how a chance encounter in a dusty bookshop had led to such meaningful connections. A boy with his grandfather, two old friends finding reconciliation, and David himself discovering a more personal relationship with the history he taught. The following Monday, David entered his classroom with renewed energy. The weekend's experiences with Joe, Bill, and Tyler had affected him profoundly, bringing a fresh perspective to the history he'd been teaching for years. As his first period students filed in, chatting about their weekend activities, David made a spontaneous decision to adjust his lesson plan. Instead of continuing with the textbook chapter on World War II, he cleared his throat and waited for the class to settle. "Today, I'd like to try something different," he announced. "We've been studying the facts and figures of World War II, the battles, the politics, the strategies. But this weekend I was reminded that history isn't just about what happened, it's about who it happened to." A few students exchanged confused glances, but David noticed several others leaning forward with interest. "I'd like you to take out a piece of paper," he continued. "Write down the name of the oldest person you know well, a grandparent, great-aunt, elderly neighbor, anyone who has lived through events you've only read about in textbooks." Pencils scratched against paper as the students complied, curious about this unexpected assignment. "Now, I'd like you to write down 3 questions you'd ask this person about their life. Not just about major historical events, but about their personal experiences. How did larger events shape their daily lives? What unexpected moments of joy or difficulty do they remember?" A girl in the front row raised her hand. "My grandmother grew up during the Civil Rights Movement." "Can I ask about that?" "Absolutely," David encouraged. "Personal perspectives on major historical movements are invaluable." "My great-grandfather fought in Vietnam," another student volunteered. "But he never talks about it." David nodded, understanding. "That's common among veterans. If you choose to interview someone who experienced war, approach gently. Some memories are painful. You might start by asking about friends they made or places they saw, rather than combat experiences." For the rest of the period, David guided his students through developing thoughtful interview questions, emphasizing respect, sensitivity, and genuine curiosity. The enthusiasm in the classroom grew as students shared ideas and personal connections to history. By the end of the day, David had introduced the same project to all his classes, transforming what had been a standard textbook unit into a living history assignment. He asked students to conduct interviews over the next 2 weeks, if possible, and prepare to share what they learned. As he packed up his materials that afternoon, the department chair, Nancy Thompson, stuck her head in his classroom doorway. "Heard you've gone off book today," she commented, her tone more curious than critical. "Personal history interviews?" David nodded, suddenly aware that he hadn't cleared the curriculum change. "I thought it would make the material more engaging." To his relief, Nancy smiled. "It's a wonderful idea. Mind if I borrow it for my classes? And maybe we could compile the best interviews into a school archive project." This unexpected support boosted David's confidence in his intuitive shift. "That would be fantastic. I was thinking small scale, but a larger archive could be really meaningful. History comes alive when it gets personal, Nancy observed. What inspired the change? David hesitated, then shared a brief version of his encounters with Tyler and Joe. Nancy listened with growing interest. You should invite them to speak to your classes, she suggested when he finished. First-hand accounts from a World War II veteran would be an incredible learning opportunity. The idea hadn't occurred to David, but it immediately felt right. I'll reach out and see if Joe would be comfortable with that. That evening, David called Tyler's home. Karen answered, and after hearing David's proposal, promised to discuss it with her father. He's been more open since your visit, she told him, almost like a dam breaking after decades of pressure. But speaking to a classroom might be challenging. Let me talk to him. 2 days later, during his planning period, David received a call from Joe himself. Tyler tells me you want me to scare your students with war stories, the elderly man said. A hint of humor in his voice. David chuckled. Not exactly. But I do think they could learn a lot from your experiences, not just about the war but about life afterward. About carrying difficult memories and finding ways forward. There was a thoughtful pause on the line. I'm not one for public speaking. Never have been. But Bill says I should do it. Says it's time to contribute to the historical record, whatever that means. You've been talking with Bill? David asked, pleased by this development. Nearly every day since dinner, Joe confirmed. Turns out 70 years of silence leaves a lot to discuss. By the end of the conversation, Joe had agreed to visit David's classes the following week. With conditions. Bill would accompany him, Tyler could attend if he wished, and David would pre-screen any questions to avoid particularly triggering topics. The news spread quickly through the school. Teachers from other departments asked if their students could attend, and eventually the presentation was moved to the auditorium to accommodate the interest. The school principal, initially concerned about disrupting the curriculum schedule, became enthusiastic after David explained the educational value of such a rare opportunity. On the morning of the presentation, David arrived early to find Joe and Bill already waiting outside, driven by Karen. Tyler had been excused from his middle school classes to attend and stood beside his grandfather's wheelchair, practically bouncing with excitement. Quite a turnout, Bill observed as students began filing into the auditorium. Didn't expect such a crowd. You two are living history, David explained. These kids have only encountered World War II through textbooks and movies. Joe adjusted his tie nervously. Just hope I don't bore them. Or worse, upset anyone with the harder truths. Honesty is what they need to hear, David assured him, not Hollywood versions of war. The assembly began with the principal introducing David, who then welcomed Joe and Bill to the stage. A respectful hush fell over the auditorium as the two elderly veterans took their positions at a small table equipped with microphones. Tyler sat nearby, beaming with pride. David had prepared a brief introduction about the significance of personal narratives in understanding history, but the real impact came when Joe began to speak. His voice, initially hesitant, gained strength as he described his early life in the 1930s, the shock of Pearl Harbor, and his decision to enlist at 18. We were just kids, he told the silent audience. Most of us had never been away from home before. We had no idea what we were walking into. Bill added his own experiences, creating a powerful contrast between the European and Pacific theaters of the war. Students listened with rapt attention as the two men shared not just the dramatic moments of battle, but the everyday realities of military life, the boredom, the camaraderie, the letters from home, the songs they sang to keep their spirits up. The hardest part wasn't the fighting, Joe confessed at one point. It was coming home afterward. Everyone expected us to step back into normal life as if nothing had happened. But we'd seen things that changed us forever. This segued into a candid discussion of what would now be recognized as PTSD. The nightmares, the startled responses to loud noises, the difficulty connecting with people who couldn't possibly understand what they'd experienced. In those days, you didn't talk about it, Bill explained. You were expected to buck up and move on. There was no counseling, no support groups, just silence and maybe too much drinking for some. When the time came for pre-approved questions from students, David was impressed by their thoughtfulness. Rather than focusing on combat or kills, they asked about friendships formed during wartime, about maintaining hope in desperate situations, about how the veterans' experiences had shaped their views on current conflicts. One student raised a hand and asked, "Do you think it's better now that we talk more openly about the psychological effects of war? Or was there some benefit to the more private approach of your generation?" Joe and Bill exchanged glances before Joe answered. "That's a profound question. I think both approaches have merits. The silence of our era created unnecessary suffering, but it also fostered a certain resilience. Today's openness allows for better healing, but sometimes I wonder if it might make some pain more persistent by keeping it constantly in focus. The truth is probably somewhere in between." As the assembly concluded with a standing ovation, David noticed many students wiping away tears. Even some of the faculty looked emotionally affected. The raw honesty of the veterans had cut through the academic distance usually maintained when studying historical events, making the human cost of war viscerally real. Afterward, several students lingered to speak personally with Joe and Bill, who seemed energized rather than drained by the experience. Tyler stayed close to his grandfather, occasionally adding comments that revealed how much he'd learned about Joe's life in recent weeks. Later that afternoon, as David helped Joe and Bill to Karen's waiting car, Joe grasped his hand firmly. "Thank you for this. I didn't realize how much I needed to tell these stories until the words were coming out of my mouth." The students were deeply moved, David assured him. "This is a day they'll remember long after they've forgotten the dates and battle names from their textbooks." "Perhaps old Bill was right all those years ago," Joe mused, glancing at his friend. "Some stories need to be told not just for the listeners but for the tellers too." Bill placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. "Only took you 75 years to admit I was right. That might be a record, even for you, Joe." Their gentle bickering continued as Karen helped them into the car, a comfortable rhythm that spoke of a friendship reclaimed and strengthened. As they drove away, David felt a deep satisfaction. Something meaningful had happened here. Not just a learning experience for his students, but a healing journey for two men who had carried the weight of history for most of their lives. Tyler, who had lingered behind to speak with David, watched the car disappear around the corner. "Grandpa seems different now," he observed. "Lighter somehow." "Sharing difficult experiences often makes them easier to carry," David replied, "especially when they're received with respect and understanding." "He's been reading his old poetry to me," Tyler continued. "The stuff from the book Mr. Hartman returned. It's really good, sad but beautiful. I told him he should try writing again." "Has he?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically. "Started yesterday. Said he wants to write about the good memories now, not just the hard ones, the friends he made, the beautiful places he saw despite the war." As they walked back toward the school building, Tyler added, "He's also been talking with Mr. Hartman about some kind of project. They won't tell me exactly what it is, but it seems important to them." David was intrigued but didn't press for details. Whatever the two veterans were planning, it was their story to tell when they were ready. The impact of Joe and Bill's presentation rippled through the school in the days that followed. Students approached history class with new enthusiasm, eager to share the interviews they were conducting with older relatives and community members. Teachers from other departments incorporated personal narrative elements into their own subjects. English teachers assigned memoirs. Art teachers had students create visual representations of family stories. Even math teachers found ways to use generational data to make statistics more engaging. The principal, impressed by the educational value of the event, suggested creating an annual Living History Day, where community members could share firsthand experiences of significant events. David was asked to coordinate the initiative, a responsibility he accepted with enthusiasm.